everybody, and welcome to the second edition of Bread Garden Market's Vinofile Wine Club. This month we're focusing in on the Rhone Valley, in particular the northern Rhone Valley. The northern and southern Rhone have some similarities, but are also quite different in a lot of ways. And today we're going to focus on some of those differences and some of the unique terroirs and regions in the northern Rhone. One of the biggest differences between the north and the south is the size. Northern Rhone comprises of about 7,000 acres worth of vineyard land. If you were to compare that and put that in perspective with the south, take Châteauneuf-du-Pape, which is a famous wine region in the southern Rhone. That region by itself is bigger than all of the northern Rhone regions combined. So size, incredibly small area. The northern Rhone is quite a bit cooler than the southern Rhone, which would make sense, but it still has a Mediterranean climate. And its climate is ideally suited for the grapes that it grows. Like many areas in France, they have kind of figured out hundreds, sometimes thousands of years ago, what grapes grow best in what regions. And according to AOC regulations, now it's AOP, if I say AOC, it's just old habits. But according to AOC regulations, the northern Rhone can only have one red grape if that wine is to be labeled northern Rhone, and that's Syrah. You cannot grow Grenache there, you cannot grow Cab there. And when I say you can't, that's a little misleading. They could put Cabernet in their wines if they want. They can grow Grenache and put it in their wines if they want. But if they do put it in there, they cannot put Rhone on the label, and they cannot put any northern Rhone region on the label. It would have to be declassified as a vin de pays or a table wine, not as that specified region. So northern Rhone, AOC, Syrah, red grape, that's it. In the south, you have dozens: Grenache, Syrah, Mourvedre, Cinsault, Claret. It just goes on and on and on. So very limited grape selection in the northern Rhone when it comes to red. Also whites. There are more white wine grapes allowed on northern Rhone labels according to the AOC, the Appellation d'Origine Contrôlée, and those are Viognier, Roussanne, Marsanne. Again, you can grow other grapes, you can put them in the wine, you just can't label them with a northern Rhone appellation or designation. So that's kind of what that means. So if you want the northern Rhone designation on your label, Syrah for reds, with a little Viognier blended in, which is a white grape, and we'll get to that when we get to Côte Rôtie. And then for whites, Viognier, Marsanne, Roussanne. So the northern Rhone, uniquely suited for these grapes. They enjoy, like I said, a Mediterranean climate. There's a particularly cold and dry wind that comes down after the rainy season in the northern Rhone called la bise. And la bise is, what does wind have to do with making wine or making a region ideal for certain grapes or certain varietals? Well, a great deal. That wind usually comes, like I mentioned, after the rainy season. So it dries the vines, dries the grapes that have started coming into started kind of blooming at this point, and it kind of blows away disease. So it's drying the vine, drying the grapes, which helps guard against rot. And the strong winds can actually kind of blow disease, blow insects off of the vines. Sounds like a small thing, but it's really not. Côte Rôtie and the northern Rhone, other regions in the northern Rhone, are really, really well protected from a lot of funguses and mites, insects, diseases that in other areas, they would not be so. Another very unique aspect of the northern Rhone are the vineyards themselves. Now the vineyards are terraced for the most part because they're extremely steep. And by steep, we're talking about some of the vineyards having a gradation of 60 to 65 degrees. And so they're kind of these steep hillsides that are kind of terraced off. It's in a very difficult area to work. They have to use hand pulleys in a lot of areas just to hand harvest the grapes. Of course, on the steepest of these vineyards, there are no machines. They would fall right over. It's impossible to get any kind of tractor or vineyard picking machine up these slopes. So all hand-picked, very difficult conditions for harvesting, which certainly plays a part in the pricing of some of the wines in these areas. Now, the Northern Rhone is also arguably the oldest wine region in all of France. It is at least 2,000 years old. It is, by most accounts, the birthplace of Syrah, or within 30 to 40 miles of what we now consider the Northern Rhone. The Northern Rhone now certainly has the moniker or the title of the King of Syrahs. Indeed, no region has more great Syrah per capita than the Northern Rhone. Just incredible, especially when you get the right producer with the right vintage. Most people have never had Syrahs like this before. The Syrahs in the Northern Rhone are literally the benchmark by which all other Syrahs are measured. A lot of people, especially in California, Oregon's actually a great example. We think about Pinot Noir in Oregon, but there are some great Syrah producers. And since the inception of Syrah making in the US, winemakers have looked to Northern Rhone as their example of truly, truly great wines. So there are 8 designated crus in the Northern Rhone. And by crus, we're talking about specific designated areas that have unique terroir. And by terroir, we're talking about climate, soil, that sense of place, where the difference is enough that the regions are separated to kind of indicate a given style or a certain type of wine. So you have Côte Rôtie, which we'll be tasting a little later, Hermitage. Those are the 2 big red producers in terms of quality. Really small, but in terms of quality. And then you could throw Carnos in there as well. Carnos makes incredible Syrah. Gros Hermitage, Condrieu, which makes fantastic white wines. We'll get to taste one of those as well. Chateau Grillé, which is actually just a single winery. So you can't have a single winery being a cru or an appellation by itself. Saint-Péray and Saint-Joseph. So those are the 8 crus of the Northern Rhone. And they could be, like I said, as small as a chateau, like Chateau Grillé, or it could be as big as a county. So crus can be very tiny, medium, large. And within those 8 crus, the 3 wines we're going to be looking at today are from Condrieu, Gros Hermitage, and Côte Rôtie. So let's start in on our first wine. Let's talk a little bit about the region first. But the first wine we're going to be tasting is the Benjamin and David Duclos Condrieu. Condrieu is, again, one of those 8 crus. If a wine comes from Condrieu, it has to be white and it has to be 100% Viognier. It is the largest producing white wine region in the Northern Rhone. But when we're talking about the Northern Rhone, size is kind of relative. Large is 1,000 acres or so. So we're talking still a very, very small production area. And Condrieux in the United States have been very, very difficult to procure for the longest amount of time. In the 80s and 90s, if you wanted a wine from Condrieux, you might be able to pick up something from a big producer like Guigal. That was pretty much it. Last 10 or 15 years, we've seen more exports from this area come over. But still, you don't see a lot of Condrieu anywhere still. We have 1, sometimes 2 producers at Bread Garden, and that's usually about it. So again, 100% Viognier. The wines from this region are just delicious, like just lip-smacking good. They're round, they're fat. They usually have like honeysuckle, tangerine, citrus, nuttiness. Nice complexity. They are aged in new oak, almost always. So you do get some of that creamy, round vanilla, but usually really well balanced. People describe them as oily, and that sounds gross. No one wants to drink oil, but they're talking more about the viscosity. It's a fat wine. It's a thick wine. You know, if you talk about, people like to talk about the legs of a wine. Legs of a wine don't indicate much, but what they can indicate sometimes is alcohol and like glycerol level. So Condrieu Condrieu wines have good legs. It's a thick wine. There's a downside to that, however. They tend to be fatter, heavier wines, in large part because of the soil composition of Condrieu. It's a lot of clay, and it's a lot of like decomposing like granite. So not a lot of mineral, not a lot of acidity results in the wines. So even though they can be very pricey and collectors love them, they're wines generally you want to drink in the 2 to 4 year range. That's kind of usually when they're hitting their peak. Acidity and minerality are kind of a great preservative of wines if you're trying to age a wine. Wines that lack acidity and minerality usually don't age that well. Doesn't mean they can't be delicious. It just means don't hold it in your cellar for 10 years. And Condrieu, although very delicious, generally speaking, are not wines I would hold on to for a long time. They're meant to be drunk young, and I would not give them more than 4 or 5 years in your cellar. Anything old, unless you trust your wine, unless you try your local sales rep at your local wine store, I would always be wary, unless otherwise told, of a Condrieu that's more than 4 or 5 years old. There are exceptions, of course, but again, drink them sooner rather than later, so you don't get disappointed. Wines like that without acidity, minerality, without what you would call the backbone of a white wine, and red wines, to be honest, they oxidize a lot quicker. So think if your wine turned into a really bad tasting sherry, if you hold on to Condrieu for 10, 15, 20 years, that's what you'll get. The wine will turn brown, and it'll just be nutty in a very off-putting way. So let's taste our wine now that we've kind of gone through all that stuff. So this is Benjamin B&D Duclos Condrieu, 100% Viognier. They're like 4th generation brothers who are winemaking, and they're winemaking very tiny parcels of land. They make Côte Rôtie as well. They make actually 3 different Côte Rôties, which are reds. We'll get to that later. But they also have very small parcels of Viognier in Condrieu, with which they make Condrieu. And we're talking about less than 13 acres total. So that's with their holdings in Côte Rôtie, that's with their holdings in Condrieu. They have about 13 acres total. So we're talking very small production, less than 3,000 cases produced for the entire winery. So small production stuff, but really, really well made. So if you kind of look at it, it's got like a nice, slightly gold color to it, a little paler than that. It's still got some freshness to it. It's not turning brown or tawny at all. This is a 2018 vintage, by the way. So we're talking a little less than 3 years old. Always give your glass a nice swirl. Oh, yeah, and that's really nice. So you get the creaminess from the oak. You do get a lot of nice tangerine. I get almost like apple, pear, cinnamon, nutmeg. So a lot of stuff going on here. This is not a wine, by the way, either that I would chill to any great extent. A little bit of a chill. You don't want to make this super cold though. All those kind of nice flavors will come out when you get a little cooler than room temp, but I wouldn't go much cooler than that. It's not beer, it's not champagne, it's not Sauvignon Blanc. It's a wine with a lot of complexity. It should be drunk a little cooler than room temperature, but I wouldn't go much cooler than that. So a little bit of floralness too. It smells really good. And yeah, very, very typical of what you would expect in a very good way from Condrieu. I get the honeysuckle, I get the nuttiness, almost like a little hazelnut, and then that pear, and a little almost Chinese 5-spice, I guess. It sounds like I'm making this up. I swear I'm not. This is an absolutely delicious, delicious wine. So the 2018 Duclos Condrieu. I hope you enjoy. If you're gonna pair it with some food, I would do it with like a heavier fish, salmon or tuna. If you want to do some pork or chicken, that would certainly be excellent with it. It's drinking excellent right now. I would drink it now over the next year or two, and yeah, enjoy. So the next cru we're going to jump into is Croz's Hermitage. Croz's Hermitage is the largest producer of Syrah in the Northern Rhone. Again, we're talking about the Northern Rhone, so large is kind of a relative term. But with that, Croz's Hermitage is probably the most variable and variant in terms of quality in the Northern Rhone. They do have some of those very steep, terraced, sloped vineyards where the best wines come from. But they also have quite a few vineyards that are planted kind of on the ground floor as well. And while they could produce very good wines as well, typically the grapes that come from those steep terrace slopes tend to make better wines. So you can have Croz's Hermitage from a producer like Brot. That's kind of easy, accessible, everyday drinking. And then you could have some Syrahs from Croz's Hermitage that are just blow your socks off delicious. So kind of a large swath there to talk about as you're going through producers. If you have any questions, again, ask your local wine store clerk. They should know, or do a little research yourself to look up some of the great producers of Croz's Hermitage. You could find outstanding Syrahs there for literally half the price of what you would pay in its bigger brothers region, Hermitage or Côte Rôtie. So great value. You can find some real gems. And in the right hands, a Syrah from Croz's Hermitage can be quite magical. And that's a great segue into our second wine here, Alain Gréaud, Croz's Hermitage. Alain Gréaud is a Syrah making master. He is one of the best wine producers in the Northern Rhone, period. Not just in Croz's Hermitage, but in the whole thing. In fact, he's one of the best winemakers in all of France. Although he's semi-retired now, his two sons have taken over the winemaking and vineyard managing duties. But they have not certainly missed a beat. This is a wine I have drunk for most of my adult life. I got into the wine business when I was about 22 years old. I bought a bottle or two of this every year. I kind of lost track of it when I moved down to Iowa, but rediscovered it a couple years ago, and they haven't missed a beat. These wines are hauntingly good. I mean, they literally haunt you. They're so delicious. And by that I mean, you taste a Syrah from Alain Gréaud and his sons, and you're ruined on Syrah the rest of your life. Because if anything is not up to that quality standard, you just don't want to drink it. It's in terms of, I mentioned benchmark for Syrah producing, Gréaud is kind of the microcosm, the epitome of what it is to make truly great Syrah. I'm going to dive into it because otherwise I'm just going to keep talking about it, and we only have but limited time. So Syrah from Croz's Hermitage tends to have a little more acidity than its other Northern Rhone brethren. At their best, it'll be floral, think like violets. They'll have that nice spiciness of Syrah. They'll be a little tannic and muscular sometimes, but usually on the softer side, especially when compared to like Cornas or Hermitage or even Saint Joseph. Yeah, so really beautifully perfumed. A lot of really nice fresh berries. A lot of that Syrah gaminess to it. Nice mineral core. Can't really smell acidity, but you can smell the brightness of a wine. So you could tell this is going to have some nice acidity to it. Man. So I get the darker berries, a little smoky, a little earthy, almost like olive or olive tapenade. The violet really comes out of that wine. Man, a little pepper, again, a little earthy on the finish. So a lot going on there, really complex. It's drinking pretty well now. It could age another 5 or 10 years, I think, pretty easily. But really a fantastic, stunning wine. Alain Gréaud and his family do have vineyards, and they are harvesting from those super steep slope terrace vineyards that we talked about earlier. So they are in possession of some of the best vineyard land in all of Gros Hermitage, and just fantastic. If I was going to pair something with this, I think game, lamb comes to mind right away. Maybe some venison, but yeah, something like a lamb would be perfect with this. So Alain Gréaud, Gros Hermitage, 2017. Hope you enjoy as much as I do. All right, now we're getting into heavyweight territory. Our last wine is from one of the best Syrah producing regions in the world, Côte-Rôtie. Now, it needs to be said and mentioned that when we talk about Northern Rhone being the benchmark for great Syrahs, there are really 3 appellations in the Northern Rhone that stand out. 2 of them are 1 and 1A, and then the third would be like 1B, although if you have the patience, they can be just as good. But generally speaking, the 2 best red wine producing regions in all of the Northern Rhone are Côte-Rôtie and Hermitage, and then a close 1B, close second, would be Cornas. Now, Cornas is one of those tiny regions that still, for the most part, make very old world style Northern Rhone Syrahs. So you got to be really patient with these. These age 15, 20, 30, 40 years. So if you come across a Cornas, have some patience, lay it down. They just get better. They're absolutely stunning. When they're young, though, a lot of producers make their wines in a way that they're just very tannic, very structured. They even shut down. When you ever hear heard someone say like, oh, the wine is closed down, they're not making that up. A wine goes through an evolution, a life cycle in a bottle. 95% of wine should be drunk within 1, 2, 3 years. But great wines from Bordeaux or Cornas, or great wines from Gevrey-Chambertin or Napa can be aged 10, 15, 20 years plus. And they go through various stages. Cornas is one of those wines that needs to evolve, needs time to age, needs time to open up. So that's kind of enough about Cornas. Great wines. I encourage you to buy some. If you find great producers, put it down in your cellar. Hermitage is the smallest, well, outside of Châteaubriand, I believe the smallest area in the Northern Rhone for wine production. And Hermitage produces monster wines. So, not to be confused with Gros Hermitage. Gros Hermitage is a completely separate region, quite a bit larger. Hermitage, very small, monsters. They require a lot of patience too, but they're so complex, they're so big. You're talking smoke, and bacon fat, and dark fruit, good tannin, just huge, huge wines. Unfortunately, Hermitage may be the hardest red wine appellation to find and source in the US. Bigger markets like Chicago, New York, LA, you can certainly find some. Very difficult to get a hold of here in Iowa. But if you're lucky enough to come across one and you have a few $100 to $1,000 to spend on, yes, 1 or 2 bottles, it can be worth the investment. Jean-Louis Chave is probably the most well-known and best producer of Hermitage, but his bottles do hit those $800 to $1,000 range per bottle. Jaboulet produces some great Hermitage as well. If you could find one, and you can, in that $60 to $150 range, where you know the producer or your wine clerk knows the producer, pick one up. It's well worth it. But we're going to be talking about Côte-Rôtie. Côte-Rôtie is a little different than Hermitage and Cornas. They're usually a little more accessible early, not always. It depends upon the producer. Some of them age extremely well and are as long-lived as any Syrahs in the world. And some drink fairly well young. They could range in price from, I don't know, $55, $60 up to about $500 to $600 a bottle. Côte Rôtie, if you look on your map on the information packet, is on the very northern part of the Rhone, and the very northern part of the northern Rhone then, obviously. So it has a cooler climate than Hermitage and Cornas. So it tends to produce wine that's more elegant. You get a lot more finesse out of Côte Rôtie. Some of the flavors overlap. You do get a little smokiness. Sometimes people associate like bacon and bacon fat with Côte Rôtie, and there are some producers where you smell it and it's like you're smelling just smoky bacon. It's delicious. But most of them tend to be elegant, refined, not like Pinot. They still have good body. They still have that tannic structure. But compared to the other great Syrah producing regions in the Northern Rhone, this is kind of your elegant finesse region. So Côte Rôtie literally means roasted slope. Côte Rôtie is actually made up of a number of different slopes. The two most important hills, so we're talking about these steep terraced vineyards again, are called Côte Brune and Côte Blanche. And the kind of name suggests, like if you look at the soils when you're in Côte Rôtie, Côte Brune is definitely darker and produces kind of a heavier, more robust style of Côte Rôtie Syrah. And the Côte Blanche is a lighter soil. So we're talking about soil composition here. And that's where you tend to get a lot of your elegant and refined wines. Côte Rôtie at its best offers a lot of depth. Red fruit, kirsch, peppers, smoke, a little bit of nice meatiness, but it tends to be really fresh as well. So you get this kind of nice, pure fruit, and it's really kind of has an elegance to it that I like a whole lot. Côte Rôtie is oftentimes 100% Syrah, but not always. They can blend another grape into Côte Rôtie. Not red. Remember, the only red grape allowed is Syrah. But Côte Rôtie, and other parts of Northern Rhone, you could blend up to 10% Viognier with the Syrah. So Viognier is a white grape. And basically what that does in terms of why would you add white wine juice to a red wine is Viognier is very aromatic. So adding the Viognier to Syrah just creates more aromatics. It doesn't affect the taste really much at all, especially when we're talking about 10% and less. But the aromatics that come off of the wine because of the addition of Viognier is really spectacular. Other Syrah and Shiraz producing regions and countries around the world have kind of copied this. There are a lot of producers of Shiraz in Australia, which is the same grape. Shiraz is the same grape as Syrah. Do add, like the Arenberg usually adds some Viognier to its Shirazes, and other wineries throughout Australia do the same thing. There are quite a few winemakers in California who add a little bit of Viognier. So again, we're talking about the benchmark of Syrah, Northern Rhone, blend a little Syrah, other countries, other wine regions around the world follow suit. Now, there's not every wine producer blends Viognier into their Syrahs and Côte Rôtie. In fact, I would say most do not. Most do make 100% Syrah. So, and that's very true for our last wine, François Villard, La Galette Blanc, Côte Rôtie. This is the 2016 vintage, which was an excellent vintage in the Northern Rhone. I chose François Villard for a number of reasons. He is one of the more interesting producers in the Côte Rôtie in terms of, he started in about 1989, 1990. And during that time, wine styles, wine was changing, wine production was changing a little bit, and big, oaky, long macerations, bombastic wines were in style. And when François Villard first started, he made these big, flamboyant, bombastic Côte Rôties. So I just talked about how Côte Rôties at their best could be kind of elegant, refined. François Villard was making the opposite of those in the late 80s and early 90s. He was just going full on I'm going to hit you in the face with this wine, and you're going to be knocked over by it. I don't care if it's out of balance or out of whack. You're going to get all the flavors I want you to get. And he has really changed a lot over the years to the point where he is made a complete 180. I mean, he is making wines that are completely different from what he was doing in the late 80s, early 90s. He uses minimum amounts of oak now. He just really is trying to have very minimal influence on, I'm going to harvest the grapes, I'm going to take them to whole cluster fermentation in the winery, and then there's going to be as little messing around as possible. And so he is trying to let the grapes speak for themselves. He has become a shepherd of grapes, so to speak, which we talked about on our last vineyard, where minimal human interference from vineyard to winemaking facility. And it's really quite remarkable, you know, maybe not as much, but this evolution of, he had a very particular style he was going for, and then over the years it's just kind of mellowed to a point where he's just making gorgeous, elegant Côte Rôtie. So I've talked way too long about Côte Rôtie, but it's worth it. Côte Rôtie is wonderful. Let's take a minute and taste this wine here. Give it a little swirl. So you're still using oak. You still get oak on the nose. Like the Crozes Hermitage, I get violet again. This is definitely more smoky. Definitely smells like it's going to be bigger, rounder, more body. I did just spill some on my shirt. Yeah, so this is nice. This is like, wow, the best of two worlds. He still has some of that kind of, I want to make a larger wine, I want to make a bigger style wine, but on the back end it has that nice elegance. I get that fresh berry. I can taste Syrah. You get the fresh berries. I get the pepper. I get a little leatheriness to it. Again, those violets are kind of right in your face, and like raspberry, like a darker raspberry or something. It's got a lot going on. This will actually age really well. So you can open it now, certainly. You'll enjoy it now. But I think it's something that you can hold in your cellar for 10 years if you have the patience and kind of see what's going on. I think it'll develop a lot more secondary characteristics. I think it'll just get smokier, maybe even a little meatier. Some of that fruit will dissipate. Some of those other structural acidity and tannic components will kind of soften a little bit, and it'll be a really gorgeous wine in 10 years, but again, drinking well now. Big Syrahs like this, again, I'm thinking game, thinking lamb chop. I don't know why boar kind of flew into my head, but something like that. It'll excellent with any kind of steak, ribeye, strip. If you did age this for like 10 or 15 years, duck would be perfect. When it kind of softens, or some other kind of game bird, it would be absolutely stunning. So I really loved all three of our wines today. I hope you do as well. If you want to save the Côte Rôtie for 5 or 10 years, I would recommend doing so, but you certainly do not. Thanks for joining us. Like us down at below at the hashtag whatever thingy we do on YouTube. I promise once we get 100, 150 more members or so, maybe we'll start having some fancy graphics and maps. And as we learn, as we get a little better at this, you know, be patient with us. We'll get there. Enjoy. Thanks for joining.